It's been a year since the Ukrainian government and separatist rebels in Donetsk and Luhansk signed a ceasefire agreement. But a lasting political solution remains elusive. In this Inside Story special, we return to the self-declared Eastern republics, where fighting in some places continues every day, and where those left behind say the world has forgotten them. Hello and welcome to this special edition of Inside Story. I'm Laura Kyle. It all began with the so-called Maidan revolution and a struggle to define Ukraine's identity. Would it look west for more integration with Europe or east to maintain close ties with Moscow? The protests forced Ukraine's pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych to step aside. Then a new struggle began, one that saw Ukraine's territorial integrity torn apart. Fighting broke out between Ukrainian forces and pro-Russian separatists. Later, self-declared republics were established in Donetsk and Luhansk. The conflict has killed some 9,000 people and forced an estimated 2 million others from their homes. Al Jazeera's Charles Stratford returned to eastern Ukraine to tell the stories of those left behind. His first in a series of reports for this Inside Story looks at the devastating effect the fighting is having on children.
They used to live in an orphanage, and now they live in a war zone. Among the girls is Nadia, who is mentally and physically disabled. Her mother was a drug addict who was murdered a few years ago. Ira's poverty-stricken mum used to take her begging before she gave her to the children's home. Nadia and Olya's mother also couldn't afford to bring them up, so decided to give them away. They all live now with their adopted parents in the village of Zhovanka, in the so-called grey zone between pro-Russian separatist fighters and the Ukrainian army. Despite repeated calls for a ceasefire, the fighting continues, especially at night.
Nadia is always very afraid when there's shelling. She cries and screams at night. We try to keep the girls calm. We try not to show them that we are afraid.
An agreement signed last February in the Belarusian capital Minsk was supposed to end the fighting. The shelling may be less intense now, but little if any progress has been made towards a lasting political settlement.
When there was the Minsk signing, we hoped that there would be some kind of agreement and that this would all stop. In reality, who is fighting here? It's brother against brother. There is only one side and there is only one nation. It's really hard to believe. I can't sort it out in my mind.
This is the Ukrainian army front line in another village close to the separatist-controlled city of Donetsk. The fighting has been intense here for control of what was once the airport. Heavy weapons are supposed to have been withdrawn to create a buffer zone as part of the Minsk deal. But both sides accuse each other of breaking that agreement almost every day. This area has seen some of the fiercest fighting since the conflict began. Now, the Ukrainian army tell us that the separatists regularly target their positions here using anti-tank weapons and mortars. They also tell us that the two towers there on the horizon are about 2.5 kilometers away, and they say that the separatists use those towers as lookout posts and sniper positions. The military take us to an area where very few people still live. They've moved 78-year-old grandmother Sonia to so-called safety 4 times since the fighting started. But she's come under fire every time, and every house has been destroyed.
I'm not going anywhere because I got married here. My children were born here. My grandchildren were born here. Everyone's gone and I don't want to go because if I do, how will they find me? I won't move until there is peace.
The conflict hasn't finished, it goes on. I personally believe the Ukrainian military are needed here in order to deter the enemy's onslaught. The conflict is frozen. We have to be here to protect and help the people who decided to stay and to bring an end to this conflict.
At a nearby checkpoint, Cossack volunteers entertain the soldiers. There are Cossacks in Russia too, but these Ukrainian men are fiercely patriotic and anti-Moscow.
It's important because people are strong in their unity when we are united, and together we will defeat our enemy.
Among the destruction of war, families like these and millions of people across this region have no interest in talk of victory. They just wish the fighting would end.
So it's worth just recapping at this point who controls what in eastern Ukraine. Now, this is the area that the pro-Russian separatists lay claim to, Donetsk and Luhansk. The two self-declared republics are not recognised by the West. And this is the line of separation that was drawn up in that Minsk agreement a year ago. The area to the left is controlled by Ukrainian troops, and the pro-Russia separatists are in the area highlighted to the right. You can see here that a number of towns, home to thousands of civilians, are stuck right on the front line. Well, this conflict has forced many in the east to choose sides. Either you're with Kiev or with the separatists and their backers in Moscow. That sentiment has ravaged the economy. Ukraine now finds itself in big trouble financially. Charles's next story looks at how businesses are coping in the east of Ukraine.
Only a boot remains of Lenin's statue in the square of Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. The Soviet leader was pulled from his plinth here and in many towns across this region after the war with pro-Russia separatists began 2 years ago. The pictures are of men from Kharkiv who died fighting for the Ukrainian side. But this city has had strong cultural, political and economic ties with Russia for centuries. It's only 30 kilometers to the Russian border. Watchtowers overlook a recently constructed fence. But Russian traders don't come here anymore, nor do people from the pro-Russia separatist-controlled and self-declared People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Small business owners in Kharkiv are suffering. Galina has worked in the market 8 years.
The two sides need to come to an agreement and stop being so stupid and thinking about themselves. It would be good for Russia and good for Ukraine. As the saying goes, a smart calf takes milk from two mothers. The situation here is really bad and it's going to get worse.
This factory was built by the Soviets in 1934. It builds turbines for hydroelectric and nuclear power plants around the world. Around 4,600 people work here. The factory has over the years built more than 90% of the turbines used in Russia's nuclear power stations. Despite the conflict, contracts signed with Russia before the war are being honoured, and the factory says dealings with Russia won't stop. There's just too much money to be made.
Despite the fact there seems to be little sign of a lasting political solution to the conflict, and the animosity between the Ukrainian and Russian governments continues, certainly at this factory it's pretty much business as usual. This piece of steel that is being cut by this giant lathe behind me is due to be exported to a hydroelectric project in Novosibirsk, inside Russia.
Our business is very important for Ukraine and the region as a whole. Our strategic plan takes into consideration that our products are so unique that there are few other companies out there that can make these.
Economists say the war, as expected, is affecting the economy in this region. But the source of the problem, they say, lies with the government in Kiev.
Businesses in Kharkiv have traditionally been connected with Russia, and a lot of people are now looking for alternatives and new export markets. In the Donbass region, the economy is only operating at 2% of its potential. But the fundamental threat doesn't lie here in the east of the country, but within the country as a whole. And that's because of corruption and a lack of reform.
The International Monetary Fund has threatened to end its support program for Ukraine if the government doesn't carry out promised reforms and deal with corruption. Ukraine's Minister of Economy and his entire team resigned recently, citing high-level corruption. President Petro Poroshenko seeks the approval of Europe and the international community and dreams of Ukraine getting EU and NATO membership one day. But analysts say Poroshenko points to what he says is Russian aggression as a means of getting support. Despite the effects of the war on the economy in Ukraine's eastern region, the bigger challenge for the leadership may be to earn the respect of people and politicians both here and abroad.
We're joined now by Oleksiy Makhayev, Political Director for the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Very good to have you with us on the show. Now, two issues that keep coming up again and again are corruption and lack of reform in the Ukrainian government. If international support hinges on these issues being addressed, what is being done to solve them?
Our country now is in state of war, in state of deterring Russian aggression. So we have to deal with two tasks simultaneously, is to counter aggression and to deter Russian Federation and to keep on going with economic reforms. And you're absolutely right, tackling corruption and financial stability are two major challenges for Ukraine. But we here in this country proceed from the understanding that the war with the Russian Federation cannot be an excuse for implementing reforms. So the President, the Parliament of Ukraine and the government are now united in working closely together in order to achieve this economic stability and to end up the age-long stage of corrupted country to fight corruption.
How are you going to do that, though? How are you going to secure this IMF loan of some $18 billion?
Our government will shortly present an overwhelming program of economic reforms, having full support of the Verkhovna Rada of the Parliament of Ukraine. And of course, tackling corruption is what we did all the last year, just to secure the existence of the needed bodies to tackle corruption, the Anti-Corruption Bureau and the institution who will prevent corruption in the government and official institutions of Ukraine.
OK, you talk about full support within the government, but there is scuffles that we see in Parliament. The Prime Minister is highly unpopular. You've had 5 ministers resigning. Most recently, the Economy Minister citing, again, corruption, cronyism, lack of reforms.
And this is why the government united yesterday, and in the course of a special meeting, they decided just to eliminate any signs of corruption from the government and from the parliament, just having backed up by the president and by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine to work together.
Now, our correspondent Charles Stratford has been speaking to people in these eastern regions. Some 6.5 million people, and many of them have already left, but they feel that they've been abandoned by Kiev, and they are asking Kiev, they're asking the government to put aside the politics and stop the fighting where they are.
It is important to stop fighting in Donbass and to bring to the people in the occupied territories and in the adjacent territories of Ukraine, to give them the opportunity to live their normal life. But in order to succeed on that path, we have to follow the implementation of the so-called Minsk agreements, which have been signed exactly 1 year ago in the Belarusian capital by Russian Federation, Ukraine, and the OSCE. The fact is that 13 points of that Minsk agreement are not implemented in full.
Why is that? Why is that? Let's get to the crux of this.
Well, it looks like exactly 1 year ago, the leaders of Ukraine, Germany, France and Russian Federation united in order to find a solution, find a peaceful solution for that conflict. But it figured out that the Russian Federation at that time didn't really want to comply with their commitments. So Russian Federation refused to cease the fire, to withdraw their troops, to close the border, to stop supplying their armed forces on our territory and the Russia-backed terrorists with modern weapons. and to resume control, to let Ukraine resume in control over the border.
Okay, but
so
there have been violations in this ceasefire on both sides. There have been a build-up in heavy weapons on both sides. We can't just blame the Russian-backed separatists here.
Well, this is not really the truth, because the Organization for Security in Europe clearly states that the number of shellings from the side of the Russia-controlled separatists is increasing, and unfortunately, in the course of the January, we have witnessed more than 1,000 shellings of our positions. So it is important that Russia and their backed terrorists comply with the Minsk agreements, stop hostilities, and withdraw their troops.
Okay. Alexei Makayev, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us there from Kiev.
Thank you.
Well, the instability in the east is continuing to force thousands from their homes. Many are risking their lives to cross from rebel-held areas into Ukrainian-controlled territory. Charles has spoken to some who are making this dangerous journey.
We're in the so-called grey zone. That's the area in between the region behind me, that checkpoint there that you can see that is controlled by the Ukrainian army, and the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic that is controlled by the separatists down this road. Now, Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, is about 5 kilometers in that direction. Now, many of the people we've spoken to in these cars today say that they have been waiting in line to cross into the Ukrainian army-controlled area up to 9 hours. And some of them won't be able to cross today because that checkpoint closes at 5 p.m.
Nobody could imagine the person you used to drink with, you are now pointing a gun at and shooting at. The situation is bad, and until recently it was quiet, but it's starting up again. That's why they are closing other checkpoints.
I'm really scared that they will completely close the checkpoints, and that would be terrible. Now at least there is a chance to get out for a while.
As an example of just how unstable the situation remains here, the Ukrainian army tell us that last night a separatist sniper near the coal mine in the distance there shot and wounded one of its soldiers. Now bear in mind that at the time there were still thousands of people on both sides of this checkpoint trying to cross. The Ukrainian army says that there was then a firefight, exchange of fire between both sides using predominantly small arms. They then said that there was a lull, and then they said a couple of hours later, after nightfall, the separatists started using mortars targeting their positions. People leaving the separatist-controlled area are made to wait behind steel mesh before the Ukrainian military check their papers and belongings. Then they drive to the other side, where lines of people coming in the other direction wait to return to the separatist-controlled area.
All this has to end. We need peace. We waited 7 hours to get out of Donetsk, and now we want to go back. I hope we get back today.
2 days after we were here, a car tried to jump the queue. It drove a few meters into the field and hit a mine. At least 3 people were killed.
We can bring in our second guest now, Alexander Hugh. He's Deputy Chief Monitor of the OSCE's monitoring mission in Ukraine. Thanks very much for coming on the show. Clearly the situation remains very volatile on the ground. Why, 1 year on from that agreement, that Minsk agreement being signed, is there still no ceasefire?
Thank you. The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission sees that the sides do not yet fully comply with the first provisions of this package of measures that was signed a year ago, and we see in particular that their activities near the line of contact do increase, and they are also very close to each other, which increases tension levels and often ends up in fighting.
But why is that? Why is neither side backing down?
The Minsk package of measures would foresee, first of all, that the fire should be ceased all along the entire line of contact. This is a line of 500-kilometer length, and to control fire along this line is difficult in itself. It would necessitate that both sides exercise full command and control over their troops. Often we see fighting starting at a small scale, geographically limited, and then it goes up and down the line of contact like a bushfire, which then ends up in severe fighting that lasts over hours, and only then it has been possible to get it under control, and that often then leads to severe damage and casualties on both sides.
When you speak to the government, as we did earlier, they very much lay the blame on Russia for the continuation of this crisis. Does responsibility lie with Moscow?
The OSCE Special Monitoring Mission's task is to record compliance with the Minsk agreement. We have seen that actually weapons have been withdrawn on both sides of the contact line, and we have also noted a change in the nature of how this conflict has been fought. Just a year ago, if you read our reports, we have been documenting the use of Smerch and Uragan, multiple launch rocket systems in the conflict zone. This is not any longer the case. Most of the violations is being conducted by small arms, but still these violations do occur more frequently so in the past days, and the sides must do more to live up to their commitment they have signed a year ago.
OK, Alexander Hugh, thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. Well, that's almost it for this special Inside Story on Ukraine. We just have time for one last story from Charles Stratford on the men, the fathers, the sons, the husbands who've disappeared over the course of this conflict. Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
Many Ukrainian servicemen have not been heard of for months. It's not known exactly how many prisoners have been taken by both sides, and the Ukrainian military says it cannot identify many of its dead servicemen. But now there are an increasing amount of people who want to know exactly what's happened to their husbands and sons, and whether, indeed, they are still alive.
Jadwiga Lozinska hasn't heard from her son Andrei since the 28th of August 2014. Through her own investigation, she believes he was travelling in a civilian car when it overturned on a road that the pro-Russia separatists and the Ukrainian army had agreed would be a safe passage. The Ukrainian army were retreating from the town of Ilovaisk when fighting broke out again.
It's unbearable, of course, but if my child comes back to me, it will be worth everything I have suffered.
This video, filmed by what's believed is a pro-Russia media organisation, shows pro-Russia fighters interrogating Ukrainian soldiers captured near Donetsk last year. And this film, shot by a Ukrainian TV channel, shows separatist prisoners captured by Ukrainian forces. But there are no official figures on the missing and the dead. Jadwiga says the Ukrainian government doesn't have the resources to find them and needs international help.
I ask that the government helps find these men who have disappeared, but our government cannot work in the occupied territories. I want them to ask the Red Cross, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the United Nations, Interpol, other international organizations to help in this search.
The government says it's doing all it can, but critics say a rushed conscription drive meant Ukraine was unprepared for the war. As was common in the Soviet Union's army, many of the soldiers were sent to battle without dog tags. And it wasn't until October 2014 that a DNA laboratory was set up specifically to analyse the war dead. And the process is slow. Medical experts say the destructive power of weapons used during this conflict, including Grad missiles, often means they are left with very little of a body to analyse. Russia continues to deny its soldiers are paid to serve in the separatist-controlled areas. It says any soldier found or killed there is a volunteer. But similar groups of people in Russia are asking where their sons are too. And journalists investigating the story in Russia have suffered intimidation and threats by what they say are people working for the Russian government. In Dnipropetrovsk cemetery, there are hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers' graves. Many are marked by a simple wooden cross. There are no names because the body of whoever lies here could not be recognized. Jadwiga has formed a group and they have contacted women in Russia looking for their missing sons also. They want to petition the Russian government for help. I am certain he will come back, she says, and I'm doing everything to make sure I see him again.